I've been debating whether to share this story for months now. My family would probably disown me if they knew I was putting this on the internet. But I need to tell someone, and maybe writing it down will help me make sense of it all. This happened when I was 4 years old in rural Hunan province in China, and I'm pretty sure it's the reason my life has been so messed up ever since. I should probably start by explaining that I was raised by my grandmother. In Chinese families, especially in rural areas, this isn't unusual. Grandparents often take care of the kids while the parents work in the cities. My parents were off in Shenzhen trying to make money, so it was just me and Nai, that's what we call grandmother, in this tiny village where everyone shared the same last name, because we were all supposedly related somehow. My granny was protective. That's putting it mildly. She kept my hair long like a girl's until I was 10, which was embarrassing as hell, but she insisted it was for my own good. She was always telling me stories about ghosts and spirits to keep me from wandering too far from the house. There were water ghosts in the ponds that would drag children underwater, and mountain spirits in the forest that could steal your soul. I thought these were just typical grandmother scare tactics to keep me from getting into trouble. I was wrong. The incident happened during my great-aunt's funeral. In Chinese culture, funerals are big family affairs that can last for days, with lots of rituals and ceremonies that I didn't understand as a kid. My great-aunt, we called her second grandmother, had died. And since my grandfather was away working as a village official, Granny had to organize everything herself. There was this girl there, about 8 years old, who was supposed to watch me. I'd never met her before, but apparently she was some kind of distant cousin. In rural China, family relationships can get pretty complicated. Everyone's related to everyone else in some way, but you don't necessarily know all your relatives. This girl was one of those relatives I'd never seen before. I was 5 and restless, and I hated being around all the crying adults. So I decided to explore. There was this mountain path behind our house that led up to a bamboo forest. I'd been told not to go there alone, but 5-year-olds aren't known for their excellent decision-making skills. The bamboo forest was dense and dark, even in the middle of the day. The bamboo grew so thick that it blocked out most of the sunlight, and the ground was covered with this red clay soil that stuck to everything. I got lost pretty quickly, which should have been scary, but for some reason, I wasn't panicked. Instead, I had this weird thought pop into my head. Not my own thought, but like someone had whispered it directly into my brain. Look up. Where the bamboo is thinner, that's the way home. The cousin girl had followed me and was getting increasingly panicked as we walked deeper into the forest. She kept calling my name and trying to pull me back, but I was determined to follow this mysterious internal compass. That's when things got really weird. It was almost noon, but fog started rolling in. Thick, unnatural fog that made no sense for the time of day. And through the fog, I saw it. A pavilion. Now, mountain pavilions aren't uncommon in China. They're usually small structures built for travelers to rest in. But this one felt wrong. There was a tall, thin shadow inside it, like a person wearing a hat that somehow connected to the roof of the pavilion. I couldn't make out any details because of the fog and the bamboo leaves blocking my view. But I was drawn to it like a magnet. The cousin girl saw it too, and she absolutely lost her shit. She started screaming and cursing, which was shocking because 8-year-old girls in rural China in the early 2000s did not curse. But she was shouting these dialect swear words that I could understand, but had never heard a child say. It was like she was trying to scare something away. When I turned to look at her, her face had changed. She looked older, not like an adult. but like she'd aged several years in the span of a few minutes. Her features were sharper, more mature, and there was this look of absolute terror in her eyes that no 8-year-old should ever have. She grabbed me and started dragging me away from the pavilion. And that's the last thing I remember clearly. I must have passed out or something, because the next thing I knew, I was back at the house, lying in Granny's bed, listening to her interrogate the cousin girl in rapid-fire dialect. The girl wasn't answering at first, like she couldn't understand what Granny was saying. Then Granny switched to Mandarin, and the girl said something that I'll never forget. I saw second grandmother coming to take Wang away, so I pulled him back. I never asked Granny about what happened in the bamboo forest. As a kid, you kind of accept that adults know things you don't, and if they don't want to talk about something, there's probably a good reason. But looking back now, I think that day was when everything started. That was the day something noticed me, and whatever it wasn't done with me yet. I'll write more about what happened next, but I need to take a break. Just thinking about that pavilion makes my skin crawl, even now, 16 years later. After posting about the bamboo forest incident, a few people asked about my grandmother and why she was so protective. I realized I left out some important details about the things she made me wear and do. Looking back now, I think she knew exactly what was coming for me. Moving to the city was supposed to be a fresh start, but weird things kept happening. I was suddenly this academic prodigy, which sounds great until you realize how unnatural it felt. I'm not talking about being smart. I'm talking about having knowledge appear in my head that I'd never learned. I'd sit down to write an essay, and ideas would just flow out of me like someone was dictating them. Math problems would solve themselves in my brain before I even finished reading them. It felt less like learning and more like downloading. My teachers loved it, obviously. My mother was proud. But I knew something was wrong because it didn't feel like me thinking these thoughts. It felt like someone else was using my brain as a computer terminal. The flip side of this supernatural academic boost was that my body was falling apart. I had chronic pain in my right leg that made it hard to walk properly. My hands were covered in eczema that wouldn't heal no matter what doctors tried. I caught every cold and flu that went around, and I was constantly exhausted. The doctors kept running tests and finding nothing wrong, which frustrated my mother to no end. When Granny found out about my health problems, she made a trip to the city. She took one look at me and immediately went into what I can only describe as crisis mode. She disappeared for a day and came back with a man she called Master, some kind of traditional healer or fortune teller. This guy examined me for about 10 minutes, checking my pulse, looking at my tongue, that sort of thing. Then he said something that made my mother's face light up. I can help him. But first, let me read his fortune to understand his fate. The reaction was immediate and violent. Granny slammed her hand down on the table so hard that she shattered a ceramic plate. She started screaming at this man in dialect, calling him an outsider who didn't understand our family's rules. The poor guy practically ran out of the apartment. My mother tried to calm Granny down, asking why she was so upset about a simple fortune reading. Granny's response was cryptic. Outsiders don't understand our rules. But here's what bothered me even then. If she didn't trust this guy, why had she brought him to see me in the first place? Instead of the fortune teller's treatment, Granny had her own solution. She gave me 3 things that I was required to wear at all times. First was a silver pendant of guanyin, the Buddhist goddess of mercy. In Chinese culture, Guanyin is like a protective mother figure who watches over children and people in distress. The pendant was old and worn smooth, like it had been handled by many people over many years. Granny hung it around my neck on a red string and made me promise never to take it off. Second was a small black cloth bag that she tied to my belt. She was very specific about this. I was never, under any circumstances, to open this bag or look inside it. When I shook it, I could hear coins rattling around, and I assumed it was some kind of traditional charm, with old Chinese coins. The bag felt heavier than it should have for its size, and it was always slightly warm against my body. Third, and this was the weirdest part, she wet her finger with her saliva and drew something on my forehead. I couldn't see what she was drawing, obviously, but I could feel her finger tracing some kind of symbol or character above my eyebrows. When she was done, she stepped back and smiled, for the first time since arriving. "My grandson is so handsome," she said, examining my face carefully. "He has a mole in his eyebrow. That's a pearl hidden in grass. Very auspicious." I didn't have a mole in my eyebrow. I'd looked in mirrors plenty of times. But after she drew whatever she drew on my forehead, everyone started commenting on this mole that I swear hadn't been there before. The effect of these protective items was almost immediate. My chronic pain started fading. The eczema cleared up. I stopped getting sick all the time. It was like someone had flipped a switch and my body remembered how to function normally. The academic downloads continued, but they felt less intrusive, more like they were actually coming from my own brain. Granny stayed with us for a week, and during that time she told me stories about our family that I'd never heard before. She said I had a sensitive constitution. In Chinese, we call it shuanao, which roughly translates to being easily disturbed or agitated by spiritual influences. She said it ran in our family, especially among the men, and that's why I needed extra protection. She also told me that my hair had been kept long for the first 10 years of my life for a specific reason, though she wouldn't explain what that reason was. On my 10th birthday, she finally let my mother cut it, but she kept every strand. She wrapped my hair in red silk and put it away in a wooden box, saying it was important to keep it safe. When Granny left to go back to the village, she made me promise 3 things. Never remove the Guanyin pendant, never open the black bag, and never let anyone read my fortune or tell me about my fate. She said that some knowledge was dangerous, and that our family had learned this lesson the hard way. I kept those promises for 5 years. I was living with just my mother in a small apartment in Shenzhen. My father was technically still in the picture, but I rarely saw him. This wasn't unusual in China during the early 2000s. Many men worked in different cities or even different provinces from their families, sending money home, but only visiting once or twice a year during major holidays. But my father's absence felt different. When I asked my mother where he was, she'd give vague answers about business trips or working outside of province. Sometimes she'd get a phone call late at night, and I'd hear her arguing in hushed tones. The next morning she'd have money for rent or school fees, but her eyes would be red from crying. In my 3rd grade, I had one brief encounter with my father, who came to help me register for school. I hadn't seen him since last Chinese New Year, and I was shocked by how he looked. He was completely bald, which seemed weird for a man in his 30s, and he had this aged, tired appearance that made him look much older than my mother. He wore a hat the whole time, spoke very little, and left immediately after finishing the paperwork. I remember thinking it was strange that he seemed so eager to get away from us. It was also during 3rd grade that I met the cousin girl again. She was 3 years older than me and attending the same school, but we barely acknowledged each other. She seemed normal enough, though I noticed she avoided looking directly at me. I wondered if she remembered what happened in the bamboo forest, or if she'd convinced herself it was just a childhood nightmare. Everything was relatively stable during those years. I was a good student, my health was fine, and the protective items seemed to be doing their job. I started to think that maybe whatever had happened when I was 5 was just a one-time thing, a weird childhood experience that I'd eventually forget about. I was wrong about that too. The problem started again when I was 13, during mandatory military training at school. And it all began with a single moment of curiosity about what was really inside that black bag. I've been putting off writing this part because it's when everything really started going wrong. I was 13, in middle school, and I made the stupidest decision of my life. I opened something I was specifically told never to open. For those who don't know, Chinese middle schools have mandatory military training where students learn basic drills, marching, and discipline. It's usually a week-long program run by actual military instructors who treat 13-year-olds like they're training for war. The instructors are typically young guys doing their national service, and they take the job very seriously. During training, we weren't allowed to wear any jewelry or carry personal items. Everything had to be regulated. This presented a problem for me because I'd been wearing Granny's protective items for 3 years straight. The guanyin pendant and the black bag had become such a part of my daily routine that I felt naked without them. I tried to hide the pendant under my uniform, but the instructor noticed the chain around my neck during inspection. He told me to remove it immediately. I explained that it was religious and asked if I could just tuck it inside my shirt, but he wasn't having it. "No exceptions," he said. "Remove it, now." So, I reached behind my neck to unclasp the chain. And that's when I discovered the problem. There was no clasp. The red string that held the pendant had somehow fused into a continuous loop. I couldn't find where it began or ended, and I couldn't stretch it enough to pull it over my head. I was starting to panic because the instructor was getting impatient, and the other students were staring at me. In desperation, I pulled out my pocket knife and cut the string. The moment the pendant fell into my hand, I felt this weird sensation, like a protective bubble around me had just popped. But I still had the black bag tied to my belt, and I knew the instructor would notice it next. I figured I could hide the pendant inside the bag temporarily, so I untied it and opened it for the first time in 3 years. The contents were not what I expected. Yes, there were coins. Old Chinese copper coins with square holes in the center, the kind used in traditional feng shui. But there was also the guanyin pendant, which was impossible since I was holding an identical one in my other hand, and a small bundle of hair tied with red thread. My hair, from when I was 10 years old. I stared at these objects, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. How could there be 2 identical pendants? Why had Granny kept my hair in this bag? And why did everything feel so much heavier than it should? I didn't have time to process any of this because the instructor was approaching. I quickly shoved the pendant I'd been wearing into the bag with everything else, tied it shut, and stuffed it into my backpack. The effect was immediate. During the first drill, my right leg gave out completely. Not gradually, not like it was tired. It just stopped working. The sensation was like sitting on a toilet for hours and then trying to stand up, except 1,000 times worse. My leg felt like it was made of static electricity and wet sand. I collapsed on the spot. The instructor, thinking I was faking it to get out of training, started screaming at me. He called me a maggot, a waste of space, a disgrace to my family. Standard military instructor stuff, but I couldn't respond because something else was happening in my head. Voices. Multiple voices, all speaking in the local dialect from my grandmother's village. They were angry, argumentative, like a crowd of people all trying to talk at once. I could understand what they were saying, but I'd never learned to speak that dialect fluently. The voices were using words and phrases that I recognized, but had never used myself. And then, without any conscious decision on my part, I opened my mouth and screamed at the instructor in perfect dialect. "You dirty dog! Dare to shout at me again!" I can't really translate this cleanly, but it's basically calling someone a dirty, homeless, mad dog and telling them to boss people around somewhere else. It's incredibly vulgar and disrespectful, especially coming from a 13-year-old directed at an authority figure. The instructor's face went purple with rage. He blew his whistle for emergency assembly, which meant the entire school was about to witness my humiliation. But before he could do anything else, I passed out from the combination of leg pain, head voices, and sheer terror at what had just come out of my mouth. I woke up that evening in the school infirmary. My mother was there, along with the instructor and the principal. Apparently, my mother had apologized profusely for my behavior, given the instructor a red envelope, which in Chinese culture usually contains money, as an apology or bribe, and convinced them not to expel me. The weird thing was, my mother didn't seem surprised by what had happened. She was embarrassed and apologetic, but not shocked. It was like she'd been expecting something like this to occur eventually. When we got home, she asked me what I'd done with Granny's things. I showed her the black bag, and she immediately noticed that it had been opened. She didn't scold me or ask why I disobeyed Granny's instructions. She just sighed and said, "We need to call your sister." Sister? I didn't have a sister. But apparently, she meant the cousin girl from the bamboo forest incident, the one who was now 16 and still attending my school. The cousin girl came to our apartment that evening. She'd grown into a serious, quiet teenager who spoke very little and avoided eye contact. My mother explained what had happened during military training, and the girl just nodded, like this was all perfectly normal. "Granny said to bring it to me if anything happened," she said, holding out her hand for the black bag. I didn't want to give it up. Those items felt important, like they were part of me somehow. But my mother insisted, and the cousin girl's expression made it clear that this wasn't a request. As soon as the bag left my hands, I felt that protective bubble sensation again, but weaker this time, like someone had patched a hole in a tire, but the patch wasn't quite strong enough to hold full pressure. The cousin girl left without saying anything else, and I didn't see her again until graduation. My mother never explained why she was involved or how she knew to contact her. It was just another family secret that I was apparently too young to understand. The voices in my head stopped after that, and my leg gradually returned to normal function. But something had fundamentally changed. I could feel a presence around me now, like someone was always watching over my shoulder. Sometimes I'd catch movement in my peripheral vision or hear whispers in empty rooms. And I started having dreams. Not normal dreams, but these weird, conference-like scenarios where I'd be lying in the middle of a dark space while groups of people argued about me in dialect. I couldn't see their faces clearly, but I could tell there were two distinct groups. Tall, thin figures on one side, and shorter, rounder figures on the other. They seemed to be debating what to do with me, but I could never understand the full conversation. These dreams continued throughout high school, becoming more frequent and more vivid as I got older. I started to dread going to sleep because I knew I'd end up in that dark conference room, listening to strangers argue about my fate. I didn't know it at the time, but those weren't dreams. They were meetings, and the people in them weren't strangers. They were my family. My grandmother died on February 23rd, 2020. The last conversation I had with her was the strangest phone call of my life, and I didn't understand what she was really telling me until much later. By 2020, I was 15 and dealing with the usual middle school problems, plus some unusual ones. My right leg was still giving me trouble. Doctors had finally diagnosed it as a torn meniscus, which is typically a sports injury, except I'd never played sports. The dream meetings were happening more frequently, sometimes multiple times per week, and I was constantly stressed about the upcoming Zhongkao, which means high school entrance exam, particularly the physical fitness component, because my leg made it impossible to run properly. In January of that year, Granny had an accident. She fell into a creek while working in the fields and nearly drowned. Some grain delivery truck drivers found her and pulled her out, but she was hospitalized for several days. My mother wanted to go back to the village to take care of her, but the COVID lockdowns made travel nearly impossible. Then, in February, Granny called us. This was unusual because she rarely used the phone. She was old school and preferred face-to-face conversations. But what made this call truly bizarre was how she sounded. Her voice kept shifting between weak and frail, which made sense for an elderly woman recovering from near drowning, to strong and commanding, which definitely did not. "Man's son," she said, using an affectionate term that roughly translates to precious grandson. "Granny's body has recovered. Don't worry about your physical fitness exam. You're going to get a perfect score. My precious grandson is the best." I was confused because I hadn't told her about my exam anxiety. My mother and I exchanged glances, and I could see that she was also puzzled by Granny's confident prediction about my test scores. But Granny wasn't done. She continued, addressing my mother directly. "Fang," that was my mother's childhood nickname. "You must never let outsiders handle family matters. Not even friends. My grandson's body is weak because his grandfather and great-grandfather lost their yinde. Yinde is a complex concept that doesn't translate well to English. It's related to karma and moral virtue, but specifically refers to good deeds done in secret, or the spiritual merit accumulated by one's ancestors. Losing yinde means that someone in your family line did something so morally corrupt that it created a spiritual debt affecting future generations." "And grandson," she said, her voice becoming urgent, "don't lose the things in the black bag, and don't lose your hair. Remember that as long as you exist, this family still exists." I wanted to ask her what she meant about the hair. My hair had been cut years ago, and I assumed she'd thrown it away. But before I could speak, she continued with something that made my blood run cold. Wang, Granny loves you. Don't forget me. And don't forget your mother and sister who take care of you. His sister again. The cousin girl who'd taken the black bag. As Granny spoke, I felt that familiar sensation of voices building up in my head. Angry, argumentative voices in dialect, like the people in my dream meetings were getting agitated. I was about to lose control and start shouting obscenities again when Granny's voice changed completely. She sighed deeply, and when she spoke again, she sounded infinitely sad and tired. "Manson, remember Granny. Granny loves you." Then the line went dead. My mother tried calling back, but no one answered. We found out a few days later that Granny had died that same evening, just hours after our phone call. Here's the thing that still gives me chills. Her prediction about my physical fitness exam came true. Due to COVID-19, all physical testing for the Zhongkao was cancelled, and every student received a perfect score by default. Granny had somehow known this would happen before it was officially announced. The funeral arrangements were a nightmare because of travel restrictions. But my mother managed to get permission for us to return to the village. What we found there was deeply unsettling. First, my grandfather and father were nowhere to be found. In Chinese culture, the husband and sons are supposed to be the primary mourners at a funeral, but neither of them showed up. My mother had to organize everything herself, which was both unusual and exhausting. Second, the village was almost completely empty. Most of the houses were abandoned or demolished. The few remaining residents were elderly people who seemed confused about why we were there. It felt like a ghost town, which made the funeral atmosphere even more eerie. Third, the funeral itself included rituals I'd never seen before. Instead of the standard Buddhist or Taoist ceremonies, my mother set up 5 tables in a specific pattern and performed what she called honoring the 5 directions: north, south, east, west, and center. Each table had different offerings and incense arrangements. When I asked her about it, she said it was an old family tradition, but she couldn't explain what it meant. The funeral lasted 3 days, and on the final day, something happened that I still don't understand. A man showed up. He was completely bald, probably in his 40s, and he seemed mentally unstable. He walked directly up to my mother and asked, "Can we build the pavilion below now?" The pavilion, like the one I'd seen in the bamboo forest when I was 5. My mother's reaction was explosive. She started screaming at him, calling him all kinds of names, saying that he wanted our entire family to die out completely. The man just laughed and pointed at the cousin girl who was helping with the funeral preparations. "Your family is already dead?" he said. "Why is she still burning paper money for us? There's just you and him left, right?" Paper money is what Chinese people burn at funerals to send money to the deceased in the afterlife. But this man was talking about it like the cousin girl was burning money for his family, not ours. And he'd said, "us," like he was speaking for a group of people. The relatives who were present just stood there. Nobody tried to intervene or throw this guy out, which was weird because he was clearly disrupting a funeral. It was like they were all afraid of him. I felt the voices in my head getting louder and more agitated, but this time they seemed to be saying, "Enough," or "That's sufficient" in dialect, like they were telling the bald man to stop talking. The man seemed to hear them too, because he suddenly stopped laughing and walked away. But he didn't go far. He turned around dropped to his knees in front of Granny's memorial altar and started crying and kowtowing. "Mama, Mama," he wailed. "You've gone well, you've gone well." This stranger was calling my grandmother Mother. My mother tried to kick him away from the altar, but he finished his crying, said his piece, and then crawled out of the house on his hands and knees. Literally crawled, like an animal. After he left, my mother immediately announced that we were stopping the funeral early. No explanation, no discussion. We packed up everything, and she sent me back to the city the next day. For the next 2 months, I couldn't get that phone call or that funeral out of my head. The voices in my dream meetings became more frequent and more intense. Sometimes I'd wake up feeling like I'd been in arguments all night, even though I couldn't remember the specific conversations. And I started having a new type of dream. Instead of the conference room scenario, I dreamed that I was lying down while someone pressed down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. In these dreams, I could see a face very close to mine, but I could never make out the features clearly. The presence felt familiar, but threatening, like a family member who'd become hostile. I'll write about what happened during my senior year of high school in the next post, when I finally learned the truth about my family. But I'm getting that familiar headache again. My senior year of high school was when everything fell apart completely. The dream meetings were happening almost every night now, and they were becoming more vivid and more disturbing. I'd wake up exhausted, like I'd been in intense negotiations or arguments for hours. My grades started slipping because I couldn't concentrate during the day. But the worst part was what was happening to my body. I'd wake up with bite marks on my arms and shoulders, bite marks that I'd apparently given myself during the night, though I had no memory of doing it. My teachers noticed that I'd sit in class with my eyes half closed, not responding when they called my name. Sometimes I'd mutter things under my breath in dialect, words I didn't remember learning. The school counselor recommended that I take a medical leave, which was a polite way of saying they thought I was having a mental breakdown. My mother agreed, and I spent the rest of senior year at home, supposedly recovering. During this time, I made a discovery that explained a lot about my mother's behavior over the years. While looking for something in her closet, I found a wig and a stack of medical documents. My mother had breast cancer. She'd been undergoing chemotherapy and had lost all her hair, which explained why she'd been wearing the wig. But here's the thing that really shook me. The dates on the medical record showed that her cancer diagnosis had come right around the time of Granny's death. I remembered that, in one of my dreams, a woman who looked like my mother said she'd given her hair to them in exchange for protecting me. I'd thought that was just a weird dream, but apparently it had been more literal than I realized. The medical leave didn't help. If anything, being at home made things worse, because I had more time to sleep, which meant more time for the dream meetings. And the meetings were becoming more intense and more frightening. In these dreams, I was always lying in the middle of a dark space while two groups of people argued about me. On one side were tall, thin figures, always bald, always speaking in commanding voices. On the other side were shorter, rounder figures, who seemed to be trying to protect me, but were clearly losing the argument. The tall figures would say things like, "Come with us. We're family. We belong together." The shorter figures couldn't speak loudly enough for me to hear them clearly, but their body language suggested they were trying to keep me away from the tall ones. These weren't normal dreams. I was conscious during them, able to think and observe, but unable to move or speak. It was like being paralyzed while two groups of people argued about my fate. Then, one day in late spring, I woke up to find two men sitting in our living room. One was an elderly man with grey hair, carrying a worn leather bag. He sat very formally, hands folded, like he was waiting for an appointment. The other was a bald man in a casual business suit who looked familiar in a way that made my skin crawl. The bald man looked exactly like the tall figures from my dreams, and his voice, when he spoke, was the same voice I'd been hearing in those dream arguments for months. "You're awake," he said, smiling. "Good." I was terrified, but also strangely excited. Like part of me had been waiting for this moment. I felt that same sensation I'd experienced when I opened the black bag, like someone else was controlling my emotions and reactions. My mother appeared and explained that the elderly man was a master who specialized in spiritual problems, and that the bald man was my uncle. My father was dead. He died falling off a scaffolding in an epileptic episode just before I turned 16. This man was his brother, and he'd been suffering from the same symptoms I was experiencing. The master was someone Granny had connected him with, someone who supposedly knew how to deal with our family's particular problems. The master examined me in ways that felt more like a spiritual assessment than a medical one. He looked at my palms, checked my pulse, and made me sit on a yellow cloth, while he performed what I can only describe as an exorcism. He had me drink a mixture of water and burned paper ash. Talisman water that tasted exactly like you'd expect burned paper to taste. Then he had me sit in a wooden tub filled with more paper ash, while he poured hot water over me and chanted in a language I didn't recognize. During this ritual, something very strange happened. The master lit a bundle of incense, and the smoke started rising normally. But when he brought it close to me, the smoke began flowing downward, like it was being sucked into something below me. The master's face went white. He immediately extinguished the incense and stepped back. "Too long," he said. "Too deep. I can see it, but I don't dare look directly. This evil requires two treatments, healing the body and healing the spirit." He packed up his things and left, clearly shaken by whatever he'd seen. A few days later, a different man came to the house. This one was middle-aged, more confident, and he seemed to know exactly what he was dealing with. He had me strip down and lie on a large brown cloth while he performed a more intense ritual. This man used burning alcohol instead of incense, drawing symbols on my back, with his finger dipped in flaming liquor. The sensation was like being branded, and I found myself laughing uncontrollably. Not because it was funny, but because something inside me thought the whole situation was hilarious. When the ritual was over, I stood up and looked down at the man, feeling incredibly proud and superior, like I just won a contest. But I wasn't in control of these emotions. It felt like someone else was using my body to express their feelings. The man was staring at my chest and abdomen with a look of absolute terror. He whispered something in dialect that I couldn't quite catch, but it sounded like he was identifying specific spirits or entities that were attached to me. My uncle handed him a cigarette with shaking hands, and the man said, "I can't do it. He's too high-ranking. I can't drive him away, and I don't even know who he is." That's when I realized what was happening. The he they were talking about wasn't me. It was someone else, Someone who was using my body as a host. Someone with a higher spiritual rank than a professional exorcist felt comfortable challenging. The man left, and we were back to square one. Except now I knew that whatever was wrong with me wasn't just psychological. There were actual entities involved, and they were apparently too powerful for traditional spiritual healers to handle. But my mother and uncle weren't giving up. They had one more plan, one more person to call. And this final intervention would reveal the truth about everything that had been happening to me since I was 5 years old. So, now you know the whole story, or at least as much as I understood of it. I've been thinking about whether to post this final part, because once I tell you what I learned about my family, there's no taking it back. The third and final intervention came from someone my uncle called the real master. This person was different from the others, older, more confident, and apparently powerful enough to handle whatever was attached to me. One evening, my mother, uncle, and the master set up what looked like a dinner party. They arranged a table with specific foods, tofu, bamboo shoots, and a whole fish, and lit white candles instead of electric lights. The master told me to sit at the table with them, but something felt wrong about the whole setup. In the candlelight, I couldn't see anyone's faces clearly. The person sitting next to me, who should have been my uncle, looked different. Older, balder, and he was eating in this mechanical, urgent way, like he hadn't had food in years. On my other side, someone else appeared. Someone with a round face and messy hair, who was eating with 2 chopsticks simultaneously, shoveling food into their mouth like they were starving. I tried to move, to speak, to do anything, but I was frozen in place. I could only watch as these 2 figures devoured the food while completely ignoring my presence. When morning came and the electric lights were turned back on, the table was destroyed. The fish was reduced to just the head and tail. The tofu was scattered in pieces, and my mother and uncle were lying unconscious on floor cushions, like they'd passed out from exhaustion. The master, who now looked ancient, much older than he had the night before, explained what had just happened. "Those weren't dreams you were having," he said. "Those were actual meetings, and the people in them weren't strangers." He led me to a dark room and showed me something that made everything click into place. In the darkness, I could see 2 tall, thin figures kneeling in front of me. Even though I couldn't make out their faces, I knew exactly who they were. "This is your grandfather," the master said, pointing to one of the kneeling figures. "And this is your great-grandfather." Both men were dead, had been dead for years, but their spirits had never moved on. The master explained the truth about my family's curse. My grandfather and great-grandfather had gotten involved in some kind of spiritual practice, possibly a cult, possibly just traditional folk magic gone wrong, that allowed them to extend their existence after death. But maintaining this unnatural state required a constant supply of life energy, which they were stealing from their own descendants. They'd already killed several family members. The cousin girl's parents had died young. My real father had died of epilepsy in Shenzhen in 2018, but his death wasn't natural. It was caused by spiritual parasitism. I was supposed to be next. The women in my family, Granny, my mother, even the cousin girl, had known about this curse for years. They'd been fighting a secret war to protect the younger generation, using traditional protective methods and their own life force as shields. The master revealed that he wasn't just a random spiritual healer. He was working with Granny, possibly even channeling her spirit. The entire sequence of events, the failed exorcisms, the dinner party, the revelation, had been carefully orchestrated to draw my grandfather and great-grandfather out of hiding so they could be dealt with permanently. "Your grandmother loves you," the master said, and for a moment his voice sounded exactly like Granny's. "She's been protecting you your whole life, and she's not going to stop now." The final confrontation took place on Qingming Festival, Tomb Sweeping Day, when Chinese families traditionally honor their ancestors. The master took me back to the village, to the bamboo forest where everything had started. The pavilion was still there, exactly as I remembered it from when I was 5. But now it contained 3 graves, one for my great-grandfather, one for my grandfather, and one for my real father. My uncle confirmed that the 3rd grave belonged to my actual father, and that he himself was indeed my father's younger brother. He'd been suffering from the same spiritual attacks I was experiencing, which explained his strange behavior at Granny's funeral. The master performed one final ritual at the graves, burning paper money and speaking directly to the spirits. "You have died and should move on. Stop lingering in this world. To me," he said, "what's done is done. Move forward." And just like that, it was over. The voices in my head stopped. The dream meetings ended. My physical symptoms gradually disappeared. For the first time, I felt like myself, in years. But the cost had been enormous. My mother's cancer, Granny's early death, my father's epilepsy, the cousin girl's orphan status. All of it had been sacrifices made to protect me from a curse I didn't even know existed. I asked my uncle why my grandfather and great-grandfather had done this, what they'd hoped to gain from tormenting their own family. He said he didn't know the full story, and that some knowledge was better left buried. I'm going to stop writing about this now. I've told you everything I know, and I think that's enough. My family paid a high price to give me a normal life, and I don't want to waste their sacrifice by dwelling on the past. But I'll never forget what they did for me. And I'll never stop being grateful that I was born into a family of women who were stronger than the darkness that tried to claim us. Thank you so much for spending your time with me and this story. This is my very first tale, and it would truly mean the world to me if you enjoyed it. If you'd like to hear more Chinese horror stories like these, I would be so grateful if you share what you think in the comments section below. Until next time, take care.